What's going on, guys? If you know anything about me by now, you know the beginning is always the most awkward part. How do I say hello? How do I start? Welcome back to the channel. I don't know, it feels really awkward. Let's just jump right into it. Today, you and I are talking about metabolism, and specifically answering a question I get a lot on Instagram, which, by the way, if you don't follow me, you can do that here, or Rico will put it here. I don't know, it'll be on the screen. A question I get a lot is there such a thing as being in a calorie deficit for too long? Or can being in a calorie deficit damage your metabolism? Or is there such a thing as too much of a calorie deficit? These are all different variations of the same question, and I want to discuss that with you. Now, before we get into the whole video, I want to answer the question. The short answer to the question is yes. The longer answer is it depends. It's very nuanced, and it's, number one, probably not for the reason that you've been told, and it's also probably not as dangerous as you've been told, and I want to explain why. There are two major aspects to this discussion. There's the physiological aspect, which I think most people pay almost too much attention to. They focus on the extremes, and I'll get into that in a second. And then there's also the psychological and behavioral aspect, which I think that most people don't pay enough attention to. And I think that's really where the major issues lie. So we're gonna save that for last. And first, we're just gonna talk about the physiological issues, what you need to be aware of, who specifically is at the greatest amount of risk, and how you can avoid it. So the major concern with being in too much of a calorie deficit or going for too long usually revolves around metabolic damage. And this is one of those catch-all terms that a lot of people use on Instagram and social media, either when they're trying to scare you and or when they don't really know what they're talking about. And what I wanted to do was I really wanted to get the most up-to-date medical insight on this. So I called my friend Dr. Spencer Nadolski. If you don't follow him, his Instagram and his Twitter accounts are amazing. He's a tremendous doctor. He works a lot with especially people who have obesity. He's done tremendous work in the field. I very much encourage you to follow him, and thank you, Dr. Spencer, for talking to me before this video. So I got his opinion on metabolic damage, and I wanted to discuss that more with you. So first things first, when we're talking about metabolic damage and answering this question, can you be in too much of a calorie deficit? Again, the answer is yes. You can have metabolic damage from being in too much of a calorie deficit and from being in a deficit for too long, especially if it's aggressive. But we really have to clarify what's going on here, because just saying yes, you can have it doesn't tell you what metabolic damage is, or even how likely it is, or how long it will persist. This is what's really important to discuss, is especially the idea of how long the damage lasts, how long and how serious. If we're talking about metabolic damage from a lifelong, irreversible, very detrimental aspect, that's really not that likely. And I was talking with Dr. Spencer about this. The example he used was the most common scenario that he sees from a lifelong issue is when someone is in a very, very severe calorie deficit for a very long time, oftentimes women, where they will lose their period and they will not be able to get it back for the rest of their life. I was very interested in that because a lot of women struggle with this, especially short term. They go into a calorie deficit, they start losing weight, and if it's a little bit too intense and or if it's for too long, they'll lose their period. But what happens is if they then increase their calories and they normalize and stabilize, their period will come back. But what Dr. Spencer wanted to really make sure I spoke about was if you do it for too long in a too aggressive of a calorie deficit, it could get to the point where you lose it and it will not come back. And that is a very serious implication to your metabolism and to your overall health. And I really want to make that clear, but also to consider the fact that that's if you're doing it to a point of starving yourself. If you have serious disordered relationships with food, this is not what most people are doing. And I really want to just hammer that home. Most people are not trying to diet to the point of starvation. They're not doing this to the utmost extreme. And that's really what is important to remember here. When people are talking about long-term severe metabolic damage, that will happen if you do it in a very unhealthy, unsafe, not recommended way. And I really want to make this clear because a lot of people are worried about long-term metabolic damage like this when it's really just fear-mongering around the most extreme example. Most people don't have to be worried about that. And I really want to make you feel comfortable and safe in understanding that as long as you're doing this in a healthy way, as long as you're not starving yourself, as long as you're not taking this to the extreme, as long as you're just doing this in a normal, healthy environment with normal, healthy strategies, it's going to be fine. That being said, let's talk about short-term metabolic damage, because this is also worth considering. One of the common arguments against calorie counting, and specifically being in a calorie deficit to lose fat, which, as you know by now on this channel, the only way to lose fat is to be in a calorie deficit. But one of the common arguments against it is people will say, well, if you eat in a calorie deficit, your metabolism will go down, it will drop. Your metabolic rate will go down. And they say it as though it's this horrible, dangerous thing. It's okay. It's not bad for your metabolism to go down a little bit. That's a natural part of being in a calorie deficit. If you want to lose fat, your metabolism will drop. Now, the greater of a drop in your calories, the more drastically you drop them, the more drastically and more quickly your metabolism will decrease. You also have a greater risk of losing more muscle, which is also another aspect of metabolic damage. And another reason why, especially if you're relatively lean and healthy already, you don't want to drastically reduce your calories. You're much better off with a slower progression, because you won't have such a drastic drop in your metabolism. You won't be as tired. You won't be at risk of losing as much muscle. Your libido will not drop as quickly. You'll be able to maintain a healthier overall status in terms of your mindset and your emotions and your behaviors and your physiology by keeping it slow and steady rather than going as quickly and rapidly as possible. But no matter what, there will still be a reduction in your metabolic rate. And that is okay. And I want to discuss this a little bit more. Some people like to sensationalize this idea of metabolic damage, even in the short term, that, oh my God, you're really willing to reduce your metabolism in order to lose fat? As though it's like, first and foremost, like, ask them, what is the definition of metabolism? Like, do they even know what the fuck that means? Most people don't. Second of all, in life, and I'll give you a specific example in fitness, sometimes you have to do things in a way that will cause damage in the short term so that in the long term you can benefit. Easiest example is when you go to the gym and you're working out, you're lifting weights. What happens to your muscles? They get damaged. You are literally tearing your muscle fibers apart. If someone heard that and they were like, oh my God, you're really willing to tear your muscle fibers apart in order to get stronger and build bigger muscles? Yeah, I am. It's the only way to get stronger, is to tear them down and feed yourself appropriately, rest appropriately in order to build them up bigger. That's how that works. And we are okay with that because we understand what's gonna happen on the other side. Same thing with nutrition, with fat loss. When you want to lose fat, you eat in a calorie deficit. When you eat in a calorie deficit appropriately, your metabolism will drop, and that's okay. Keep your protein high. Don't drastically reduce your calories. Don't do a ton of extra cardio. You'll lose fat. And then when you increase your calories, when you're done with the cut, when you start going into more of a maintenance mode or more of a surplus, your metabolism will come right back up and you'll have a leaner body fat to begin with. And so then you can continue making progress. We could take this to the extreme. Someone could go to the gym and they could do way too much. They could lift way too heavy, way too many sets and reps, too much volume, not recover enough, then they get rhabdo, which can kill you. You can go to the extreme and have very negative side effects of going to the extreme, of course. But using the extremes as the example for what most people to follow is disingenuous, and it's not what you should be worrying about. If you're following a good training program, you're tearing your muscles apart. Recover, feed yourself, get stronger, build more muscle. If you want to lose fat, you're going to be reducing your metabolism. Do that for the short term. Be consistent, be smart, feed yourself appropriately. Don't do too much cardio. Don't go too intensive with your calorie restriction. Be more flexible. And then when you switch phases, your metabolism will recover and you'll be leaner and you'll be ready to go into the next phase. So now before we go on, I just want to tie some things together. Can you be in too much of a calorie deficit? Yes, you can. In the same way that you can also be in too much of a calorie surplus. Being in too much of a calorie deficit, getting to too low of a body fat, that's dangerous. Being in too much of a calorie surplus, getting to too high of a body fat percentage, that is also dangerous. It's important to discuss both sides of things, because if we only look at one, it's very easy to be misled and to be tricked into thinking that the extreme is the norm. That's not the case. Dangerous to be in too much of a calorie deficit for too long, dangerous to be in too much of a calorie surplus for too long. That doesn't mean that's where most people fall, and it's probably not where you fall. Now, what I want to discuss really quickly is how much of a calorie deficit is safe. How long should you be in a calorie deficit from a physiological perspective? And this really depends on a number of things, not least of which is where you're starting out from a body fat percentage. And I was talking about this with Dr. Nadolski, and one of the things he brought up was very interesting and very much in line with what I've noticed with my clients and inner circle members. If someone has a lot of weight to lose, if they have morbid obesity, 100 pounds, 200 pounds, they can go in a much more drastic calorie deficit and for a longer period of time without it negatively affecting them from a physiological perspective, and sometimes even psychological too, because they have much more to lose. But the leaner you get and the less body fat you have, it gets much more dangerous to go into a much more drastic calorie deficit. From the perspective of, if you are already relatively lean and you want to go in a very, very steep calorie deficit, you're way more likely to lose muscle mass. You're way more likely to lose your libido. You're way more likely to lose your period. You're way more likely to lose your hair. You're way more likely to have a lot of the negative side effects the more of the norm you fall into. On the extreme end, of course, you have more leeway. We could go the other way, for example. Let's say you're working with someone who's very, very, very underweight. They've been severely underweight for a long time, and they need to gain weight quickly or else they might die. Then you put them in a very rapid calorie surplus so that they can gain that weight quickly. But if someone's more in the middle, relatively lean, but they want to gain weight, you're not going to put them on an extreme calorie surplus because then they'll gain body fat very quickly. And that's not good either. For most people in the middle, a slow and steady increase in calories for a slow and steady calorie surplus for a slow and steady muscle gain phase is the way to go. So they don't add too much body fat. Same in reverse, slow and steady calorie deficit for the majority of people who are already relatively lean. But if you're on either end of the extreme, you can use some extremes until you find yourself in the middle. So with all of that said, let's move on to the psychological and behavioral aspect, which is what I really think is the most important. It's what we need to focus more on. Before we do, really quickly, if you're enjoying the video, please give the video a thumbs up, subscribe if you don't already, and leave a comment down below, by the way, with hashtag #SortingHatSquad. If you haven't seen this before, it's relatively new. I'm gonna pick 3 people who hashtag #SortingHatSquad and like the video to win a free month in my inner circle, which I will announce in my next video who the winners are. I spent a fair amount of time in planning this video, trying to figure out how I wanted to discuss this section for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think it's the most important section. And also, it's where my passion lies in discussing the psychology and the behavioral side of things. And what I decided on is I want to tell you a story. A friend of mine, she's a personal trainer, and several years ago, she saw a ton of people doing figure competitions. Bodybuilding shows, physique shows, and she was like, I want to try that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of them, mainly because I've seen how many people who do them and then end up struggling with disordered eating as a result, but I supported her no matter what. I said, I personally wouldn't recommend it, but if you decide to do it, I'll support you. I didn't coach her. I don't think it's a really good idea to coach very close friends or anything, but she was working with a very reputable coach, and when she started it, she had a very, 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 very healthy relationship with food. She was very normal body fat percentage, incredibly healthy. She never really thought about food too much other than just how to eat in a way to best support her mentally, physically, emotionally, from a muscle gain perspective, from a strength perspective. She had everything, it was in check, and she was very healthy. When she started prepping for the physique competition, everything changed immediately. And it was very shocking, because it went from such a healthy relationship with food, a flexible, approachable, enjoyable approach, to so rigid and so anxiety producing and so isolating. I think that's a really important point to hit on. Isolating, not being able to enjoy food out with friends or family. Everything had to be prepared at home, bringing your Tupperware everywhere, and watching as she progressed, it was on one hand beyond impressive. To see the resolve, to see the drive, the determination, to see the results coming in, it was amazing. Every waking moment for her was around her food, making sure it was weighed and measured, making sure she prepared it exactly the way it needed to be with the exact right amount of calories. And it was very interesting for me to watch from that psychology perspective, because as she was eating her tilapia and green beans and everything, she would always be talking about what she wanted to eat after the show. She would make a huge list of foods that after the show, what she was gonna binge on. And it was like treated like a joke. I can't wait to have this, I can't wait to have that, said lightheartedly, but it was a very deep-seated emotional response. Like, I can't wait to have all of these foods. The show went, she did amazing, incredible job, she's watching, she knows I'm talking about it right now. It was an unbelievable binge, just like immediately after the show. And we see this a lot with a lot of figure competitors, men and women, where after the show they balloon up. They don't even have to do a show. We see this with people who just do drastic cuts on Instagram and YouTube, people who publicize their cutting, who do it very, very extreme and then immediately gain like tons of weight thereafter. And I'll never forget how it didn't just last that day. After the show, she had a huge binge, and the next day she binged. And the next day she binged. And it kept going on for weeks and weeks. And she gained way more weight back than she had initially lost. And this is where a lot of people start to talk about metabolic damage, where, oh my God, you hurt your metabolism so bad that all of a sudden you gained more weight than you had lost before. And they blame it on the metabolism, but they're not really explaining what was going on here. Why was she binging? Why was she eating uncontrollably? Why couldn't she get full? Why couldn't she be satiated? Why did she have to feel like she had to eat all of this food? It wasn't that her metabolism was ruined, it's that her relationship with food was ruined. And when your relationship with food is ruined, you do things that encourage you to gain weight. If you lose your ability to feel full, of course you're gonna overeat. If you completely restrict and restrict and restrict and then binge, of course there are going to be negative side effects. In a very reductionist point of view, might look like it's physiological, but when you're analyzing their behavior, you understand it wouldn't have happened if they hadn't done the extreme rigid protocol in the first place. Anyway, going back to the story, what happened next was probably the most surprising to me. As she's binging, she decides, I'm gonna do another show. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? You just spent months completely abstaining from hanging out with friends and family, from being able to enjoy your food, just only talking about all the foods you're gonna eat when you're done with this. And now you've done that, you've gained a lot of weight, you feel very insecure, not posting on social media the pictures of how she actually looked then, mostly posting pictures of the competition just to show that what she did look like, and now she's gonna do another one? And I realized that a lot of people go through this cycle of extreme cut, prepping for a competition or not, but extreme, then binge, and then extreme again. And a lot of physique competitors will do this because the competitions are in their mind what keeps them lean. The competitions are their motivation to stay on track. And as soon as the competition is over, that's their justification for binging. And that's what they allow themselves to do. That's how they justify it. And they continue to compete over and over and over again, not because they actually love competing, but because that's how they prevent themselves from going so off track that they gain a ton of weight. And it's a very, very isolating, scary place to be, and especially to feel like the only way to stay lean is to enter into a competition. And I think that that is the side of fitness and physique competitions and metabolic damage that most people are not talking about. And I should clarify, not everybody who competes in figure competitions struggles with this. There are ways to do it in a safe and healthy way. But I also want to clarify and say that a lot of people who compete do struggle with this. And even if you don't know it, and even if they don't say it, even if they seem as though everything is fine, it does not mean that they actually are okay. Back to the story, I expressed my concerns with her, and she went through with it several times. This was a cycle, probably over the course of about a year and a half. Until eventually, through talking with her, she was like, I can't do this anymore. She had lost her period, hair had been falling out, she had no sex drive, she wasn't as happy, and she was like, I just miss not thinking about food all the time. I just miss being able to go out to dinner and not have so much anxiety that I'm losing all my progress. It really took getting to a point, to an extreme of just so much angst and fear and anxiety that she was like, I just can't do this anymore. And I'm telling you this story for two main reasons. The first one being, yes, there are physiological components to metabolic damage and weight gain after dieting, but usually the main reason why people will gain so much weight after dieting has to do with this. We could have spoken about someone who's a yo-yo dieter, someone who's very overweight, someone who tries to do a very extreme diet like a juice cleanse, they lose a lot, and then they gain it all back. It's the same thing, because they're going through extremes that they can't sustain. This always comes down to sustainability, right? So that's reason number one, to show you that even though it might look like it's physiological and metabolic, it's usually psychological and behavioral, and that's why we really need to attack that. The other reason I wanted to tell you this story is because maybe you can relate. I'll never forget, I mean, granted it was only several weeks ago, but I'll never forget the response I got in regard to my binge eating video, which if you haven't seen it, the link is in the description. It was overwhelming in the most positive way. How many people replied in the comments and sent me emails and DMs thanking me for discussing my issues with binge eating in the past, because above all else, it made them feel like they weren't alone. And not only that, but that they could overcome it, and they had never felt like they could openly talk about it before. And so I wanted to tell that story because maybe you can relate to the anxiety of going out to dinner and not wanting to ruin your progress, or constantly thinking about food, or putting all of your meals in Tupperware, or whatever it is. Maybe you can relate to that story in some way. And if you only get one thing from this video, outside of metabolic damage and eating in too much of a calorie deficit, I hope that what you take from this is the confidence in your ability to make the right decision. We all know, by and large, that the very extreme dieting, the very extreme methods to lose weight very, very, very quickly are probably not the best choice. But on the other hand, emotionally, a lot of times they look really nice. Someone posted about it on Instagram, got amazing results. They said, maybe I should do that. Maybe I should be losing weight faster. Maybe I should be losing more weight. Maybe I'm not making progress enough. Maybe I should do something extreme just for a little bit, but you know better. And I want that to be what you take from this video. The confidence in yourself to know that you can make the right choice, that you can see the other stuff people are doing on social media and not let it affect you, not let it make you choose the wrong decision. Because the right choice, as you know in your heart and in your mind, is to be slow and steady, to be patient, not to give up. Because even if this doesn't really affect you physiologically, it sure as shit's gonna affect you psychologically and behaviorally. And when all is said and done, when you're looking back on your life, when you're 90 years old, are you gonna be more proud that you lived a happy life, that you could enjoy your favorite meals with your friends and family, that you could be healthy, that you lived a healthy, happy, strong life and didn't take things to an extreme? Or are you gonna be happier that you ended up yo-yo dieting, that you ended up being so restrictive that you couldn't enjoy a slice of pizza at your kid's birthday party, that everything was centered around food? I have a feeling that you're probably gonna be happier if you can look back and say that you were more moderate with your approach. So I hope this video gives you some confidence to do that. I hope you know I'm always here to help. Any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe if you don't already, and don't forget about the Sorting Hat Squad competition in the comment section. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.